The greatest crime of the totalitarian systems of the world was the Second World War of 1939-1935. 30s of the 20th century were the years of becoming totalitarian systems in Italy, Germany, the Soviet Union, Spain, and Romania. This was the birth of fascist ideologies, radical nationalism, period the culmination of imperial ambitions of the greatest states of the world. Nations, states, and people became a burgeoning chip. The fate of Ukraine, as well as the fate of many European nations, was solved by the massive door of large politics. Being torn between the states, having survived the tragic totalitarian regime, going through tornadoes of Holodomor, Ukraine was again abandoned to their fate during the Second World War. In Moscow, on August 23, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in official Soviet historiography it was named the Treaty of Non-Aggression, was signed between the Soviet Union and Germany, but the secret protocol agreement allowed the two states to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and to satisfy their territorial appetites. On September 1, 1939, as a result of provocation on the German-Polish border, Germany started the aggression against Poland. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union sent its troops in western Ukraine, western Belarus, and the Baltic countries. On September 3 to 5, the UK and France entered into the war. Was it possible to prevent the further growth of future war? Was it possible to prevent a great number of victims? According to modern historians, yes. But there had to be three conditions. First, if there were a sufficient competent and authoritative League of Nations. Second, if the Soviet Union, like France and Britain, opposed Germany on the side of a sovereign Polish state. Thirdly, if peaceful Soviet foreign policy were really peaceful. May 11 to September 16, 1939, November 30, 1939 to March 13, 1940, Soviet-Finnish War. All these dates are to give an objective assessment of the actions of the USSR at the beginning of the Second World War. An objective assessment of actions of Nazi Germany was given by a Nuremberg tribunal. One can say very much about mistakes of the Soviet leadership, but we should not forget that there was no plan of defense in the Soviet command. 3.5 million of the Soviet soldiers stood on the western border and were ready to liberate Europe from Nazi domination and the implementation of world revolution. Stalin's regime put millions of victims for the realization of Marasmus ideas. That is why people, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Russian, were betrayed by their own country. From the first days of the war, a resistance movement unfolded. In Ukraine, it was presented in two ways: communist or partisan and nationalistic. Until 1942, Soviet partisans were not recognized by system. Population from the occupation zone was called traitors, and only the fear of mass and uncontrollability allowed to establish Ukrainian partisan movement headquarters on June 30, 1942. The troops, made up of Besangit soldiers, ordinary people, gave the terror to the occupants. Partisans' armies were in Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Baltic forests. Among the famous partisan formations were the formation of Kolpak, about 2,000 soldiers, and the formation of Fedorov, about 5,000 soldiers. Quite often, partisan activity became the cause of the atrocities of the Nazi invaders who used the local population as hostages. During the war, 250 Ukrainian villages were burned to the ground. In the early days of the war, The nationalistic resistance movement hoped for the German army in the liberation of Ukraine from Bolshevism. In Lviv on June 30, 1941, the act of the Ukrainian state was proclaimed. The Ukrainian national government, led by Stetsko, and the Ukrainian National Council, headed by Levitsky, were established. But on July 5th, the Germans arrested the entire leadership of the OUN. Following these events, the national movement went underground and led an active struggle against the invaders. In general, the resistance movement had a single goal: the expulsion of the invaders from the territory of Ukraine, but there were internal differences. Often partisans entered into conflict with the nationalists. Tragic conflict developed between the Polish and Ukrainian national liberation movements. Berlin Tragedy, 1943. As always, the division among Ukrainians generated lack of ideological content and was used by third parties. Ukraine's liberation from Nazi invaders, October 27, 1944, brought to Ukrainians faith and hope in the bright post-war life, but the restoration of Soviet power again resulted in a tragic pages of history. Soviet Bolshevik regime, keeping the socialist regimes of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, condemned its own people to starvation. About 1 million victims was the price of friendship between countries of socialist camp. A massive operation against the Crimean Tatars was carried out on May 18, 1944. In summary, it should be separately identified and emphasized that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the Second World War, a crime against humanity, and Bolshevik political elite with the Nazi leaders had to sit on the dock in Nuremberg. In 1945, fascism was defended. Bolshevism extended its life for nearly 50 years, crippling people's lives and souls.